You get so many queries about ponds and water from people because everybody loves some water in their garden, and I think it is brilliant, particularly from the point of view of wildlife. It brings in the birds, the insects, and it's magnetic to watch. People always think they're hard work, but really I think they're really easy. I should be raking off the leaves. It's better if you don't let the leaves go in because they sink to the bottom and they form the aquasoil, natural debris that accumulates at the bottom of the water. And sometimes this can go a bit smelly, but the way that you keep it sweeter is you just add something called calcium sulfate in the autumn, and that really sweetens that aquasoil in the bottom of the pool. And if you make it as big as you can afford spatially, I think it makes more impact. If you've got a tiny pool, it's going to become greener. You're going to need to recirculate the water to keep the oxygen levels up. I'm probably making it all sound very complicated, but basically you don't want too much sun on, so we've got a bit of shelter here from trees, cast shadow on it. We've got water lilies which come out in the summer to keep the heat off the pool. We've got marginal plants and we've got submergent plants. And I think it's pretty maintenance free. Of all the things in the garden, it has precious little attention, but it always looks pretty good. You do need quite a few plants. People always want a gin clear pool, and you can achieve that when you fill it up, which you would probably do in spring is the best time really to do this, and then it suddenly gets warm. You'll find that an awful lot of green will form naturally, and it does take about, I would say it can take 3, 4, 5 months to actually form a good balance in the pool by having lots of oxygenating plants, some submerging plants, some marginal plants, not too much sun on the water, and then you get a nice balance. But if you don't have those plants in there and you have lots of sun, you get lots of green sludge forming. So just bear that in mind to get the balance right. And it is perfectly possible to get a good balance and to have clear water, provided you don't have lots of fish in it. Now, if you go and bung lots of fish in a pool, they bung out nitrates and you feed them, and that makes the water full of green algae and things like that. So they really are not good to put in a pool if you want a clear pool. If you do that and you have a koi carp, then you've got to have filters and oxygenators and all sorts of things like that. Fish come in naturally. We don't put fish in, but they obviously appear because ducks come and they have fish eggs on their feet, and quite quickly you'll get carp and things in there. So you can either remove them or enjoy them and then just put up with a bit more green water. When you put in marginal plants and submergent plants and water lilies and things, you'll find they all grow abundantly. And so what you need to do every so often is divide them. So we'll pull out the submergent plants, which become quite thick. We'll put them on the side of the pool and we'll leave them there for a day or two, and all the creepy crawlers can then creep back into the water. The water lilies become much too big. These are quite a vigorous variety, which I got from Stapleford Park when I was doing the water there. And so we lift them out every 2 or 3 years, chop them in half, and that's quite a job. They're really thick, vigorous root, and just cut them in half or quarters, pull off bits, put them back into the baskets, weight them down and put them back in. Otherwise they will just cover the whole pool, and then also they start to grow up high because they're reaching for the light and they're becoming too crowded. The Xanthodeskias, they're a lovely plant, and people often think they're not hardy, but in the UK, if you keep them in water, they seem to be perfectly hardy, and they've been in there for many years. When you're digging your pool, designing your pool, you need to have a certain depth. If you're going to have the marginals around the edge, so you have the shallower sides and then it goes down to a much deeper area. And really you should go down to about 1 metre depth, which is quite a depth, to stop the marginals colonising the reeds and things like that, the whole space. Otherwise you'll be in there regularly clearing out the reeds and things if you want some clear water in the middle. Now if you don't want to do a big deep pool but you want to make it look deep, you can put in the black dye, and we've done this at Chelsea and other places. You can get a black dye or a dark blue dye, and as soon as you put it into the water, it makes it look very deep, and it gives lovely reflections from it. Now, if your water is running water, it keeps mixing it up. If it's still water, then it will tend to settle over time. So it's better if you do that, if you have a fountain or something like that. I mean, sometimes we just do little jets coming in around under the coping, around the edge of the pool, which is a very nice, simple way to have moving water and have the sound of water. Obviously, you can put the central fountains and you can make them very elaborate or very simple. There are all sorts of jets that you can choose from. But the dye is also a good way to suppress the weed growth because it's filtering out the light, so therefore you don't get so much aquatic growth, so it's easier to control. And sometimes they use that in big fishing lakes when they're having an explosion of marginal of aquatic plants growing far too much. That just subdues their growth a bit. Now, if you have children, you always have the problem is water is not safe with young children who can't swim. They can potentially fall in. And so what we did when the children were young is we put an underwater grid. We just got a reinforcing mesh with the decent sized gaps in it, and we hung it underneath the coping so you couldn't see it, and the grid actually sat about 25 mil below the water. The water lilies and things like that grew up between in the spring, and the margin plants, so you couldn't see it. And then if the children did fall in it, it was a very shallow water and they could hopefully climb out. And you can now buy these commercially. And I think if you have got children, that is the best thing to do because they love water too, but you really don't want them to have any nasty accidents. And you can do that grid system. We fitted it with informal pools and with formal pools. We've just finished relining the pool. Now, we needn't have actually relined the whole pool, but the reason we did it is because although we had a leak in the liner and it was dropping consistently to about 150 mil below the top, we had actually initially laid the pool and done something really bad. We had actually got one end higher than the other end because of the falls on the ground. And so what we did is we took the opportunity to reline the whole thing and bring the back end up by putting lots more soil at the back end of the garden and then relining it. If you have got a hole and you see where the water level has dropped to, you can then run your finger carefully around that whole length where the water line has now become, find the hole and you can patch it. But because I wanted to lift the whole back end, we relined it all. So it was quite a process. You drain the water out, we put the sludge on the beds, it's lovely stuff, really useful, got lots of organic matter in it, sweep it out, and then we put the new liner on top of the old. Now we've used EPDM. It's 1 millimetre thick and it's very, very hard wearing. It's got a guarantee of 20 years. But when they use it in big reservoirs and things like that, then they put soil over the top of the whole of the liner, and so it lasts for pretty much ever. But obviously, if it has lights to it and you've got foxes and dogs jumping in the water or roots penetrating it, then it might puncture it. But we have an underlay underneath the liner which helps stop things puncturing it from underneath, like the roots and things, and any sharp stones. And generally they are very hard wearing things. Now, everybody talks about butyl liner, but butyl is incredibly difficult to get hold of. And in fact, everyone uses EPDM instead, but no one, because it hasn't got a very catchy name, knows that it's EPDM. And indeed, on a television program, when they featured lining a pool, the suppliers supplied them with EPDM, but the presenters kept calling it butyl because they didn't think the public would know what EPDM was. But anyway, if you've got something like this, 10 to 1, it is EPDM. I mean, there are many PVC type liners which are much cheaper, but this is the sort of Rolls Royce of the liners. Now, when we actually do the top, the coping, you must detail that correctly, because everybody hates seeing the liner. So the number one thing is to get the water level as high up as you can to the coping and to have an overhang on the coping. So we've got a good 25 mil overhang of the coping overhanging the edge of the pool, and the edge of the pool in this case are just earth. We just did pretty much vertical sides to the pool. We didn't do any concrete lining or anything like that. We only did a bit of bedding to sit the slab on just immediately under the slab, but the sides are just earth, and the soil is such that we can do that. It's been in for maybe 30+ years and it's been absolutely fine from the point of view of the walls being stable. But when we did the coping on the top, the key thing is when you put the liner in and then you lay it underneath the slab, imagine this is a thick coping slab, and you bring the liner right up to the top where the grass is now, and then you cut it off afterwards at that level. So therefore the water is held tight to the top of the slab. Obviously with evaporation and things like that, we've never put an overflow on a pool like this, because even if we have massive rains, it might overflow, but I've never seen it overflow, to be honest. And it just sits nicely at that level. We top it up every so often, because obviously with evaporation you do lose quite a bit, and sometimes we actually specify automatic top-ups, but that's quite expensive and quite elaborate procedure. So in normal domestic situations we just top it up manually. Now, because we don't have a chlorinated water supply, this is just spring water, we can put fish and plants straight in, but if you haven't, you are meant to rest it, I think, for about 10 days to let the chlorine gas off. When we're doing wildlife pool, we often just cover the whole of the base of the pool with about 100 mil of soil, and we plant the marginal plants around the edges at the correct depth, which is probably about 100 to 200 mil deep. But when you put that soil into the pond, if you put a very high organic nitrogen-rich topsoil, again you're going to get lots of green algae growing on it. So you want to fill it with a subsoil, so it's quite poor. And you don't want lots of clay particles in that subsoil, because if you have got wildlife in the pool, like fish and things, when they move around, the clay will go into suspension, it will make it look cloudy. When you're thinking about water and the design of the pool, obviously you'll start, do I have a formal pool or do I have an informal pool? So I've gone for a formal pool here because it's a fairly formal space. I've kept it really quite simple. I just put little curves on the end and the balls. I could have gone for any shape pool, really, couldn't I? But obviously the rectilinear shape fits in them with a garden. I do think hard pools like this with hard edges are much easier to disguise the lining than when you have soft informal pools. So when we do a soft informal pool, we have exactly the same thing with the liner, but we put the earth all over the liner, and we have a gentle slope going up, and then we pull it up at the end. But the earth and the marshy marginal plants hide that zone where you've got the water hitting the grass. And some people find that very difficult, and that is where you can sometimes see problems with the liner showing. So if you've detailed it right and you've got a sloping bank and you've covered the liner with a good 150 mil of soil or soil and pebbles, whatever, that should definitely do the trick. But if you do have in areas where it is exposed, you can use the coir rolls, and these are just coir matting filled with soil, and then you have the aquatic marginals growing in that, and you can put these sausage rolls all around the edge and they will just totally disguise that edge bit. So that's a very useful tip for hiding the liner. But with any hard liner, as I said, you have the overhang here, and if you're using bricks it's exactly the same. You want a decent overhang to hide that liner coming up. Now if I'm doing a very expensive pool, then I will have the slab and the liner, but I'll cloak the liner in stone or granite or something for the top, 6 inches, 200 mil, something like that. So if the water level does drop because of evaporation, then you will actually see the hard stone rather than the black liner. So that's, if you want to spend a bit more money, that's a fail-safe way to do that. So have fun with your pool, enjoy it, and don't think it's hard work. It doesn't have to be.